The Galactic Council chambers buzzed with the familiar sounds of 100 different species conducting their daily business. Ambassador Sarah Chen sat quietly in the human delegation's modest corner, reviewing reports on her tablet while around her, the more established species held court with their impressive entourages and gleaming technology. "Look at them," hissed Zektar, the Draconian representative, his scaled lips curling into what passed for a smile among his kind. The humans still use those primitive tablets, not even proper neural interfaces. His comment drew chuckles from several nearby delegates. The Draconians had arrived in the galactic community only 50 years ago, but their rapid technological advancement and aggressive expansion had quickly earned them a seat among the most powerful species. Their sleek, obsidian-colored warships and energy weapons that could slice through most known materials had made them the enforcers of choice for the Council's more questionable decisions. Sarah looked up from her tablet, meeting Zektar's golden eyes with steady brown ones. "We find tablets sufficient for our needs, Representative Zektar. Sometimes the simplest tools are the most reliable." "Simplest, yes." Zektar's voice carried across the chamber, drawing more attention. "Your entire species seems to prefer the simple approach. Simple weapons, simple ships, simple minds, perhaps." The chamber grew quieter as other delegates sensed the brewing confrontation. The Draconians had been increasingly vocal about humanity's place in the galactic hierarchy, or rather, their belief that humans had no business being there at all. "Our technology serves its purpose," Sarah replied calmly, though her jaw tightened slightly. "As does our approach to diplomacy." "Diplomacy," Zektar laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "You mean surrender? Your species has avoided every major conflict for the past century. When the Xerian rebellion threatened trade routes, where were human ships? When the Void Wraiths attacked the outer colonies, did humanity send aid? No, you sent words, treaties, discussions." Other delegates were nodding now. The Crystalline Collective's representative, a being of living mineral, chimed in with sounds like breaking glass. "The humans do seem risk-averse. Perhaps their physiology makes them naturally timid." Sarah felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest, but kept her expression neutral. This was nothing new. Humanity had joined the galactic community as one of the physically weakest species ever encountered. No natural armor, no claws, no venomous fangs or psychic abilities. Just clever hands, pattern recognition brains, and an unfortunate tendency to die when shot, stabbed, or exposed to most of the universe's hostile environments. "We believe in exhausting, peaceful solutions before resorting to violence," Sarah said. "Surely that's preferable to the alternative." "Preferable for prey species, perhaps." Zektar's golden eyes glittered with amusement. "But not for those who shape the galaxy's future. Tell me, Ambassador Chen, what would humanity do if faced with a real threat? Not pirates or raiders, but a true existential crisis." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew the answer, had seen the classified files that most humans weren't even aware existed, but she also knew that some truths were better left unspoken. "We would do what we've always done," she replied. "Whatever is necessary." "Whatever is necessary," Zektar repeated mockingly. How wonderfully vague. "Like everything else about your species." The session continued with routine business, but Sarah could feel the undercurrent of tension. The Draconians had been pushing boundaries for months now, testing limits, probing for weaknesses. Their military had grown bold, sometimes accidentally entering human space during training exercises, always with polite apologies afterward. After the session ended, Sarah made her way back to the human embassy, a modest building compared to the towering spires and crystalline palaces that housed other species' diplomatic missions. Inside, she found Director James Morrison waiting for her, his weathered face grim. "I saw the session feeds," he said without preamble. "Zektar's getting bolder." Sarah nodded, sinking into a chair. "They think they have us figured out. Weak, passive, irrelevant." "And what did you tell them?" "The truth. That we do whatever is necessary." Morrison's expression darkened. "Sarah, we've received intelligence reports. The Draconians are massing their fleet near the Kepler sector. That's less than 10 light-years from our closest colonies." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "How many ships?" "Over 3,000. Battlecruisers, destroyers, carrier groups. It's the largest military force they've ever assembled." Morrison leaned forward. "Our analysts think they're planning something big. Not just against us, but against several of the smaller species. The Draconians want to restructure the entire galactic order, with themselves at the top. And humanity? According to intercepted communications, we're to be made an example. A demonstration of what happens to species that don't know their place. Sarah stared out the window at the alien skyline, her mind racing. For over a century, humanity had played the role of the weak but clever species. The diplomats and mediators who solved problems with words instead of weapons. It had served them well, allowed them to build relationships and establish trade networks without the constant threat of military conflict. But it had also created a perception problem. The galaxy saw humans as useful but ultimately harmless, like domesticated animals that had learned to speak. The Draconians, with their warrior culture and technological superiority, represented everything humanity appeared not to be. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, "I think it's time to send a message to Earth, Priority Alpha." Morrison raised an eyebrow. Priority Alpha communications were reserved for existential threats to the human species. They hadn't used that designation since the first contact protocols were established. "Are you sure? Once we send that signal, there's no going back. The Council will know something's changed." Sarah thought of Zektar's mocking laughter, of the casual dismissal in the eyes of species that had forgotten what humans were capable of when pushed too far. For generations, humanity had chosen peace, had bent over backward to avoid the conflicts that had torn apart previous galactic civilizations. But peace, Sarah realized, was only possible when all parties wanted it. The Draconians had made it clear that they viewed humanity's peaceful nature not as wisdom, but as weakness. And in the harsh mathematics of survival, weakness was eventually punished. "I'm sure," she said. "Send the message. Tell them the Draconians want to know what humanity does when faced with an existential threat." She turned from the window, her expression hardening. "I think it's time they found out." The message reached Earth 47 hours later, bouncing through quantum relays across half the galaxy before arriving at the unassuming building in Geneva that housed the Human Colonial Defense Authority. To most of Earth's population, the HCDA was just another bureaucratic organization, handling logistics and supplies for humanity's scattered colonies. The reality was considerably more complex. Admiral Elena Vasquez read the Priority Alpha message 3 times before setting it down on her desk. Around her, the command center maintained its usual quiet efficiency, dozens of technicians monitoring communications from hundreds of human worlds. None of them knew what the message contained, but they could see the change in their commander's posture. "Colonel Harper," she called to her aide, a serious young man who'd been with her for 5 years. "Initiate Lazarus Protocol." Harper's eyes widened slightly. In all his time serving under Vasquez, he'd never heard those words spoken aloud. "Ma'am, I need to verify that order." Vasquez pulled up her authorization codes and submitted to a biometric scan. Across her desk, multiple security systems confirmed her identity and authority. "Lazarus Protocol is now active, Colonel. Begin Phase 1 immediately." As Harper hurried away to implement orders that had been planned but never executed, Vasquez stood and walked to the massive display screen that dominated one wall of the command center. It showed a real-time map of known space, with human colonies marked in blue, friendly species in green, and potential threats in various shades of orange and red. The Draconian Empire blazed crimson across a significant portion of the galaxy's outer rim. "Admiral," came a voice from behind her. She turned to see Dr. Marcus Webb, the HCDA's chief scientist, approaching with a tablet in his hands. Webb was one of the few people on Earth who knew the full scope of what humanity had been quietly developing for the past century. "Doctor, I assume you've heard?" Webb nodded grimly. "The Draconians are forcing our hand. Are we really going to do this?" Vasquez looked back at the display. "They think they understand us, Marcus. They see our diplomats being reasonable, our merchants being fair, our colonists being peaceful. They think that makes us weak. Maybe we should have shown them different earlier." "Maybe," Vasquez agreed. "But our predecessors made the choice to develop in secret, to let the galaxy think we were just another species of clever mammals. It gave us time to learn, to grow, to prepare. Now that preparation gets tested." Across the galaxy, the first phase of Lazarus Protocol began to unfold. On Kepler Prime, the human colony that the Draconians considered their most likely first target, Governor Lisa Park received a coded transmission that made her blood run cold. She immediately ordered a general evacuation drill, not uncommon for a frontier world. But this time the civilian ships that responded weren't heading for nearby shelters. They were heading for jump points that would take them far from Kepler entirely. On the industrial world of New Osaka, factory workers continued their normal shifts. But the products rolling off their assembly lines had changed. Instead of agricultural equipment and mining tools, the factories now produced items that hadn't been manufactured in decades. The workers, conditioned by years of security briefings, asked no questions. In the depths of space, automated monitoring stations that had been dormant for generations suddenly came online. Their sensors, far more sophisticated than anything the galaxy suspected humans possessed, began tracking Draconian fleet movements with unprecedented precision. And on a dozen worlds that appeared on no public star charts, facilities that officially didn't exist received activation orders from Earth. Admiral Vasquez was reviewing deployment schedules when her aide returned. Phase 1 is underway, Admiral. All stations report readiness within acceptable parameters. And our friends in the Council? No unusual activity. The Draconians are still broadcasting their standard training exercise cover story. Most species seem to believe it. Vasquez nodded. What about our intelligence assets? Harper consulted his tablet. Agent Morrison reports that the Draconians are planning to move within the week. They want to present the Council with a fait accompli. Attack our colonies, claim they were responding to some manufactured provocation, and dare anyone to challenge them. Classic bully tactics, Vasquez mused. Hit the weakest target first, establish dominance, then expand from there. Admiral, Dr. Webb interjected. I've been running projections based on the Draconian fleet composition. Their standard tactics rely heavily on overwhelming firepower and superior armor. They expect enemies to either flee or die quickly. They've never fought an enemy that did neither, Vasquez observed. Exactly. Their weapons are designed to punch through heavy armor and shields. Their armor is built to resist direct energy strikes. Their tactics assume conventional engagement patterns. Vasquez smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. And we've never been particularly conventional. 3 days later, the Draconian fleet began moving toward human space. Over 3,000 ships, ranging from massive dreadnoughts to sleek fighters, formed a battle formation that stretched across several light years. To any observer, it represented one of the most powerful military forces ever assembled by a single species. Aboard the flagship Dominator, Fleet Commander Sektan studied tactical displays with satisfaction. The human colonies in this sector were lightly defended, with only a handful of patrol ships and some orbital defense platforms. Intelligence reports suggested the humans would likely evacuate rather than fight, making this more of a demonstration than a true battle. Commander, his tactical officer reported, we're receiving a transmission from the human colony at Kepler Prime. Put it through, Sektan ordered, expecting to hear terms of surrender. Instead, a human woman appeared on his screen. She looked tired but determined, wearing the simple uniform of a colonial governor. I am Governor Park of Kepler Prime, she said. Your fleet has entered human space without permission. You have one chance to withdraw peacefully. Sektan's laughter echoed across the bridge. One chance? Human, you are addressing the combined might of the Draconian Imperial fleet. Your pathetic colony has perhaps a dozen patrol boats. What exactly do you think you can do to us? Park's expression didn't change. We can do what humans have always done when threatened with extinction, Commander. We can remind the galaxy why our species survived long enough to reach the stars in the first place. And what might that be? We can show you that the most dangerous predator isn't the one with the biggest claws, Park said quietly. It's the one that thinks before it strikes. The transmission ended, leaving Sektan staring at a blank screen. Around him, his bridge crew exchanged glances. The human's words had carried an undertone that made several of the Draconians unconsciously check their weapon systems. Sir, the sensor operator called out. I'm detecting some unusual readings from the colony. Sektan moved to the sensor station, studying the displays. Kepler Prime appeared normal on most scans, but there were strange energy fluctuations deep underground, patterns that didn't match any known human technology. How long until we reach optimal firing range? He asked. 6 hours, sir. Sektan nodded. Maintain course, and send a message to the Council. Tell them that the Draconians are about to demonstrate the price of weakness in an unforgiving galaxy. As the massive fleet continued its approach, none of the Draconians noticed the subtle changes happening throughout human space. Ships that looked like ordinary cargo haulers were taking up positions along major trade routes. Space stations were quietly evacuating non-essential personnel. And across 100 worlds, humans were implementing protocols that their grandparents had hoped would never be necessary. The galaxy was about to learn something that humanity had spent a century keeping secret. Sometimes the most dangerous species was the one that everyone underestimated. Fleet Commander Sektan stood on the bridge of the Dominator, watching the tactical display with growing confusion. The human colony of Kepler Prime lay directly ahead, defenseless as expected, but something felt wrong. His decades of military experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming warnings. "Sir," his communications officer called out, "we're receiving multiple transmissions from across the sector. Human civilian ships are broadcasting standard evacuation codes." Sektan nodded. This was expected. Humans typically fled rather than fight, choosing survival over honor. It was one of the many things that made them contemptible in Draconian eyes. "Any military response?" "Negative, sir. A few patrol ships launched from the colony, but they're heading away from us, not toward us." "Cowards," muttered Sektan's second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Vekros. "They won't even pretend to defend their own people." But something nagged at Sektan. In his experience, even the most peaceful species would make some gesture of defiance when faced with annihilation. A few brave souls would always choose to die fighting rather than live in shame. Yet the humans seemed to be abandoning their colony without even token resistance. "Sensor sweep of the system," he ordered. "Full spectrum analysis. I want to know if there's anything we're missing." The results came back within minutes. Kepler Prime showed normal colony infrastructure: cities, industrial facilities, spaceports, and mining operations. The planet's 2 moons were unremarkable chunks of rock. Several asteroid mining stations dotted the outer system, all apparently abandoned. "Nothing unusual, sir," reported the sensor operator. Except what? "There are some odd energy readings from the planet's surface, deep underground. The patterns don't match any known human technology in our databases." Sektan studied the data. The energy signatures were faint but consistent, scattered across the planet in what looked almost like a grid pattern. Could be geothermal taps or deep mining operations. Humans are always digging holes in things. "Yes, sir. Should we proceed with the bombardment?" Sektan was about to give the order when his tactical officer spoke up. "Sir, we have new contacts. Multiple ships dropping out of jump space at the system's edge." The main display shifted to show the newcomers. Sektan counted 30 ships, all of human design, spreading out in what looked like a defensive formation. They were too far away to effectively engage his fleet, but their presence was puzzling. "Ship types?" "Mixed composition, sir. Some appear to be modified cargo haulers, others look like escort vessels. Nothing that should threaten us." Vekros laughed. "Finally, some humans with spine. Too bad they'll die for nothing." But Sektan wasn't laughing. Something about this entire situation felt like a trap, though he couldn't identify the nature of it. The humans had had over a century to study galactic warfare, to learn from other species' mistakes. Surely they wouldn't commit such a small force to a hopeless battle unless they had some kind of plan. "Open a channel to the human ships," he ordered. A moment later, a human face appeared on the screen. The man was middle-aged, wearing what looked like a merchant captain's uniform. Behind him, Sektan could see a bridge that seemed almost primitive compared to Draconian standards. "I am Captain Rodriguez of the merchant vessel Esperanza," the human said calmly. "You are violating human territorial space. Withdraw immediately or face the consequences." Vekros couldn't contain his laughter. "Consequences? Human, you have 30 ships against our 3,000. What consequences could you possibly threaten us with? Rodriguez's expression didn't change. The same consequences we've always threatened with, Commander. We just haven't had to follow through on them before. And what might those be? Sektan asked, curious despite himself. Complete extinction of your fleet, Rodriguez said simply. We've studied your tactics, your technology, your psychology. We know exactly how you fight, and we've prepared accordingly. The audacity of the statement left even Sektan momentarily speechless. Then he realized what he was witnessing. The humans weren't just making a final gesture of defiance. They actually believed they could win. Human, Sektan said slowly. You are either the bravest being I've ever encountered or the most delusional. Either way, I'm curious to see what you think you can accomplish. You won't have to wait long, Rodriguez replied. We've been wondering for decades what would happen if someone forced us to stop being diplomatic. Thank you for providing the opportunity to find out. The transmission ended, leaving Sektan staring at a blank screen. Around him, his bridge crew maintained professional composure, but he could sense their uncertainty. The humans' confidence had been absolute, unshakable. Either they were insane, or they knew something the Draconians didn't. Sir, the sensor operator called out urgently, I'm detecting massive energy spikes from across the system. The underground sources on the planet are activating, and there's something happening near those abandoned asteroid stations. Sektan moved to the sensor console, studying the displays with growing alarm. The energy readings from Kepler Prime had increased by several orders of magnitude, and similar signatures were appearing throughout the system. What he had taken for abandoned mining stations were lighting up like small suns. Analysis? Unknown, sir. The energy output is unlike anything in our databases. It's almost as if the entire system is some kind of massive machine. Before Sektan could respond, space around his fleet began to change. Points of light appeared in the void, growing rapidly brighter. At first he thought they might be some kind of weapon discharge, but the patterns were wrong. Instead of aimed shots, the lights seemed to be forming geometric shapes in three-dimensional space. Sir, his tactical officer shouted, something's happening to our navigation systems. I'm reading spatial distortions throughout the area. Sektan felt the first cold touch of real fear. Distortions? What kind of distortions? The space around us is changing, sir. Distances are no longer constant. Some of our ships are reporting that objects are farther away than they should be, while others are saying everything is too close. On the main display, Sektan watched in horror as his perfectly organized fleet began to lose cohesion. Ships that should have been in formation were drifting apart or clustering together in ways that defied physics. Worse, when he tried to order course corrections, his communications seemed to be taking different amounts of time to reach different vessels. What are the humans doing to us? Vekros demanded. Before anyone could answer, Captain Rodriguez's voice filled the bridge again, though no communication channel was open. Space is funny, the human said conversationally. Most species think of it as empty, just a void between stars. But humans have always been good at seeing patterns, at understanding systems. We figured out a long time ago that space isn't empty at all. It's full of energy, dimensions, quantum fluctuations. And if you know how to manipulate those things. Sektan tried to respond but realized the human couldn't hear him. This wasn't a two-way communication. The thing about being underestimated, Rodriguez continued, is that it gives you time to prepare. A century of preparation, in our case. We've had time to study every species in the galaxy, to understand their strengths and weaknesses. We've had time to develop technologies that no one expects us to have, because no one thinks we're clever enough. Around the Draconian fleet, space continued to distort. Ships found themselves separated by impossible distances or uncomfortably close to collision. Navigation systems that had worked perfectly for centuries were reporting contradictory information. You wanted to know what humans do when faced with extinction. Rodriguez's voice carried a note of cold satisfaction. We cheat. We change the rules. We turn the battlefield itself into a weapon. Sektan grabbed his communications console, trying to reach his other ships, trying to coordinate a response. But distance and time seemed to have become fluid things, making coordination impossible. For the first time in his military career, Fleet Commander Sektan began to understand what true terror felt like. The Draconian fleet, once a terrifying symbol of military might spread across several light years, now found itself trapped in a maze of twisted space-time. Fleet Commander Sektan watched his tactical displays with mounting horror, as ships that should have been kilometers apart collided with each other, while others seemed to stretch impossibly far into the distance despite maintaining the same heading. "Emergency jump," Sektan ordered desperately. "All ships, initiate emergency jump procedures." His navigation officer's claws clicked frantically across his console before looking up with terror in his golden eyes. "Sir, I can't establish jump coordinates. Our position keeps changing. The navigation computer can't lock onto any stable reference point." Captain Rodriguez's voice echoed through the bridge again, still somehow reaching them despite no open communication channels. "Jump drives require precise calculations of position and velocity relative to local gravity wells. But when space itself becomes fluid, when distance becomes negotiable, those calculations become meaningless." Sektan could hear similar reports coming in from across his fleet. His ships were powerful, their weapons devastating, their armor nearly impenetrable, but none of that mattered when they couldn't tell where they were or predict where they were going. "How is this possible?" Vekros snarled, his usual confidence replaced by confusion and growing panic. "No species has technology like this." "That's because no other species needed it," Rodriguez answered as if he could hear their conversation. "Most galactic civilizations develop along similar paths. Bigger guns, stronger shields, faster ships. They compete in an arms race that's been going on for millions of years. But humans took a different approach." The displays around Sektan's bridge began showing impossible readings. Some of his ships appeared to be in multiple locations simultaneously. Others seemed to be moving backward through time. His communications officer reported receiving messages that wouldn't be sent for several more minutes. "We studied the nature of reality itself," Rodriguez continued. "While other species were perfecting energy weapons, we were learning to manipulate the fundamental forces that hold the universe together. While they were building bigger ships, we were discovering how to make space itself our ally." Through his view screen, Sektan could see some of his ships beginning to experience structural stress. The spatial distortions were putting impossible pressure on their hulls, twisting them in ways that three-dimensional objects weren't meant to be twisted. Several smaller vessels had already been crushed by forces that existed in directions that shouldn't exist. "Sir," his chief engineer reported, his voice tight with fear, "our hull integrity is dropping. The ship's being subjected to stresses from angles our design never accounted for." "All weapons fire at the human ships," Sektan ordered. "Whatever they're doing, stop them." Energy beams lanced out from hundreds of Draconian vessels, powerful enough to vaporize mountains. But in the twisted space around Kepler Prime, the beams curved back on themselves, spiraled into impossible knots, or simply vanished into dimensional folds that shouldn't exist. Some shots that were aimed at human vessels struck Draconian ships instead, the beams having somehow reversed direction in transit. "Weapons are ineffective, sir," his tactical officer reported unnecessarily. "The space around us is acting like some kind of maze. Our shots can't reach their intended targets." "Then how are they doing this to us?" Vekros demanded. "If we can't hit them, how can they affect us?" Rodriguez's voice carried a note of what sounded almost like pity. "Because we're not shooting at you, Commander. We're not using weapons at all, at least not in any way you'd recognize. We're using the universe itself." On the tactical display, Sektan watched his fleet continue to disintegrate. Ships designed to withstand the firepower of entire planetary defense systems were being crushed by invisible forces. Vessels that had survived battles against the most dangerous species in the galaxy were simply vanishing, folded away into dimensions that existed only in the mathematics of human scientists. "The installations you detected on Kepler Prime," Rodriguez explained, his voice now coming from multiple directions at once, "aren't weapons. They're reality anchors, devices that can manipulate the quantum substrate of spacetime. The abandoned mining stations in the asteroid belt aren't abandoned at all. They're dimensional processors, machines that can reshape the basic geometry of local space." Sektan tried to process what he was hearing. The implications were staggering. If humans possessed technology that could manipulate the fundamental nature of reality, then every assumption the galactic community had made about them was wrong. They weren't weak. They were so far advanced beyond conventional thinking that they made other species look primitive. Why? He found himself asking aloud, though he knew the human couldn't hear him. Why hide this? Why let the galaxy think you were weak? As if responding to his thoughts, Rodriguez's voice softened slightly. Because power corrupts, Commander. We've seen what happens when species become too confident in their military might. They become bullies, conquerors, tyrants. They stop talking and start shooting. We chose a different path. Around the Draconian fleet, the spatial distortions were intensifying. Some ships were experiencing time dilation effects, their crews aging years in minutes. Others were being stretched across multiple dimensions, their matter existing in several places at once. The proud armada that had entered human space was becoming something abstract and incomprehensible. For 100 years, Rodriguez continued, we've let the galaxy think we were just another species of clever primates. We've played the role of diplomats and merchants, the ones who solve problems with words instead of weapons. And it worked. The galaxy was more peaceful because everyone believed humans were too weak to threaten anyone. Sekton's ship shuddered as another wave of spatial distortion passed through it. His engineering displays showed impossible readings, systems operating according to physics that shouldn't exist. His crew, trained warriors who had faced death in a dozen battles, were beginning to crack under the psychological strain of experiencing reality itself as an enemy. But you forced our hand, Rodriguez said, and now his voice carried genuine sadness. You decided that our peaceful nature was weakness. You chose to test whether humans would really do whatever is necessary when faced with extinction. The view screen showed Sekton something that would haunt him for the rest of his life, assuming he survived the next few minutes. One of his largest battleships, the destroyer, was being folded in half by forces that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. The ship wasn't exploding or breaking apart. It was simply ceasing to exist in any meaningful way, its matter being redistributed across spatial coordinates that had no names. This is what necessity looks like, Commander, Rodriguez said quietly. This is what humans do when you back us into a corner and force us to choose between extinction and action. We show you that there are worse things than being conquered. Sekton closed his eyes, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. He had attacked what he thought was the weakest species in the galaxy. Instead, he had provoked something so far beyond conventional understanding that his entire worldview was collapsing along with his fleet. We're sorry it came to this, Rodriguez said. We really are. But you needed to learn that the most dangerous predator isn't the one with the biggest claws. It's the one that can change the rules of predation itself. When Sekton opened his eyes, nearly half his fleet was gone. Not destroyed, not defeated, simply absent. Erased from reality as if they had never existed at all. In the depths of space, what remained of the once mighty Draconian fleet drifted like broken toys scattered by an angry child. Fleet Commander Sekton stood alone on his bridge, most of his crew having fled to the lower decks when reality itself began to rebel against their presence. Through his view screen, he watched ships that had taken decades to build simply fade from existence, their matter unraveling into quantum foam. Sir? Came a trembling voice from behind him. His communications officer, one of the few crew members still at his post, was staring at his console with wide, terrified eyes. I'm receiving a transmission from the human vessels. They're requesting to speak with you directly. Sekton almost laughed at the absurdity. After witnessing his fleet being systematically erased from reality, the humans wanted to talk. It was so perfectly in character for them that he felt a moment of hysteria rising in his chest. Put them through, he said quietly. Captain Rodriguez appeared on his screen again, but this time the transmission was clearly two-way. Behind the human, Sekton could see what looked like a normal merchant vessel bridge, complete with crew members going about routine tasks as if they weren't in the middle of rewriting the laws of physics. Commander Sekton, Rodriguez said, and his voice carried genuine regret. I'm sorry you forced us to this point. Truly sorry. Sorry. Sekton found his voice cracking. You've destroyed over half my fleet with weapons that shouldn't exist, and you're sorry? Yes, Rodriguez said simply. Because this isn't who we wanted to be. For 100 years, we've been the species that solves problems peacefully. We're proud of that reputation. But pride means nothing when faced with extinction. Sekton looked around his bridge at the impossible readings on his displays, at space that curved in directions that hurt to contemplate. What are you? We're humans, Rodriguez replied. The same species your representative called weak and primitive in the council chambers 3 days ago. The same species that spent the last century being dismissed as clever but harmless. We just happen to understand the universe in ways that most species find unnecessary. Unnecessary, Sektan repeated bitterly. You can reshape reality itself and you call it unnecessary? For most problems it is, Rodriguez said. Why manipulate the quantum substrate of spacetime when diplomatic pressure will solve the same issue? Why unravel the basic forces of nature when trade agreements can prevent conflicts just as effectively? Sektan stared at the human captain, trying to process what he was hearing. You're saying you've had this power all along? That every time my people threatened yours, every time we pushed boundaries, you could have done this? Yes, Rodriguez confirmed. But we chose not to. Do you understand what that means, Commander? We chose restraint. We chose to let you think you were stronger than us because the alternative was demonstrating just how wrong you were. The implications hit Sektan like a physical blow. Every negotiation, every diplomatic meeting, every moment when the Draconians had assumed they held the upper hand because of their military superiority, all of it had been an illusion. The humans had been allowing them to feel powerful. The entire galactic community, Sektan whispered. You've been letting all of us play at being apex predators while we made sure you didn't hurt each other too badly, Rodriguez finished. Yes, someone had to be the adults in the room, Commander. Someone had to choose peace over power. On Sektan's tactical display, more ships continued to vanish, not violently, not in explosions of fire and debris, but simply ceasing to exist as the space they occupied forgot they had ever been there. It was the most terrifying form of destruction he had ever witnessed, because it left no trace, no evidence that his people had ever existed at all. How long? He asked. How long have you been able to do this? The theoretical framework was developed about 70 years ago, Rodriguez said. The first practical applications came online 50 years ago. We've been refining the technology ever since, hoping we'd never need to use it. 50 years, Sektan repeated numbly. For 50 years you've been, watching us? Studying us like laboratory specimens? Learning from you, Rodriguez corrected. Every species in the galaxy has taught us something valuable. The crystalline collective showed us how consciousness can exist in non-biological matrices. The void wraiths demonstrated energy manipulation techniques we never would have discovered on our own. Even your people contributed to our understanding. What did we teach you? Sektan asked it, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The importance of having contingency plans, Rodriguez said grimly. Your species' aggressive expansion and military buildup forced us to accelerate our defensive preparations. In a way, you helped ensure that when this moment came, we'd be ready. Sektan felt a bitter laugh escape his throat. So we trained you to destroy us. You trained us to defend ourselves, Rodriguez corrected. There's a difference, though I suppose it doesn't matter from your perspective. Around them, space continued to behave in ways that violated everything Sektan thought he knew about physics. His remaining ships were trapped in a bubble of altered reality, unable to escape, unable to fight back, able only to watch as their companions were systematically erased from existence. What happens now? Sektan asked. Do you erase us all? Send a message to the galaxy about what happens when someone threatens humanity. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, and Sektan could see him exchanging glances with his crew. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with responsibility. That's up to you, Commander. We could end this right now. Your entire fleet could simply stop existing. The galaxy would search for you for years, never finding so much as a debris field. You'd become a cautionary tale about the dangers of deep space exploration. Or you survive this, Rodriguez said. You go back to your people with a message. You tell them that humanity isn't weak. We're restrained. There's a difference, and it's an important one. You tell them that we've been holding back not out of fear, but out of mercy. Sektan looked around his bridge at his remaining crew, at warriors who had been reduced to cowering children by forces beyond their comprehension. And if my people don't believe me? If they think I'm lying or delusional, then they'll send another fleet, Rodriguez said simply. And we'll have to do this again. But next time, we won't offer the same choice. The threat was delivered in the same conversational tone Rodriguez had been using throughout their conversation, but it carried an absolute certainty that made Sektan's blood run cold. The human wasn't boasting or posturing. He was simply stating a fact. Why spare me? Sektan asked it. Why let any of us live? Because that's who we are, Rodriguez said. We're the species that believes in second chances, in redemption, in the possibility that even the worst conflicts can be resolved through understanding. We're giving you the chance to choose a different path. Sektan watched another of his ships fade from reality, its crew of 300 simply ceasing to exist. The casual nature of their destruction was almost more horrifying than the destruction itself. These humans weren't angry or vengeful, they were just thorough. How many ships will you leave me? He asked. Enough to carry the survivors home, Rodriguez replied. Enough to tell your story. But not enough to threaten anyone ever again. As if responding to his words, the spatial distortions around Sektan's remaining vessels began to stabilize. Of his original fleet of over 3,000 ships, fewer than 100 remained, and those were mostly smaller vessels and support craft. His mighty battle fleet had been reduced to a limping convoy. Commander, Rodriguez said, and for the first time Sektan heard something like sympathy in the human's voice. I want you to understand something. What happened here today wasn't inevitable. Your people forced this choice on us. We would have been content to remain the galaxy's diplomats and mediators forever, but you decided that our peaceful nature was weakness. I was wrong, Sektan said quietly. Yes, Rodriguez agreed. You were. The question now is whether your people will learn from your mistake, or whether they'll force us to teach the lesson again. The journey back to Draconian space took 3 weeks. 3 weeks that felt like years to Fleet Commander Sektan. His surviving ships limped through hyperspace jumps, their crews silent and haunted by what they had witnessed. Many refused to speak about the events at Kepler Prime, simply staring into empty space when questioned. Others had developed nervous tics, constantly checking sensor readings as if expecting reality itself to betray them again. Sektan spent most of the journey in his quarters, composing and recomposing the report he would have to deliver to the Draconian High Command. How did you explain to a warrior culture that they had encountered a species so advanced that their concept of warfare was meaningless? How did you tell proud military leaders that their greatest fleet had been casually swatted aside by merchants and diplomats? When they finally reached the Draconian homeworld of Drakmor, Sektan found the space around the planet buzzing with military activity. Word of his fleet's destruction had somehow reached the High Command, and they were preparing for war. Hundreds of ships were being mobilized, defense platforms were coming online, and the orbital shipyards were working around the clock to produce new vessels. Sir, his communications officer called out as they approached the planet. High Command is ordering us to dock at Station Prime. They want immediate debriefing. Sektan nodded wearily. He had expected this. The High Command would want answers, and they wouldn't like the ones he had to give. 2 hours later, he stood in the great council chamber of the Draconian military, facing 7 of the most powerful beings in the Empire. Grand Admiral Zarthek, Supreme Commander of all Draconian forces, sat at the center of the curved table, his golden eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. Explain, Zarthek said simply, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. Sektan had rehearsed this moment countless times during the journey home, but now that it was here he found himself struggling for words. The humans, they aren't what we thought they were. That much is obvious, snapped Admiral Kethvar, Zarthek's second-in-command. You left with over 3,000 ships and returned with less than 100. What destroyed the rest? They did, Sektan said quietly. The humans destroyed them. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Admiral Mordak, the oldest member of the council, leaned forward. Commander, our intelligence indicates that the human colony at Kepler Prime had minimal defenses. A handful of patrol boats and some orbital platforms. Are you telling us that this force destroyed our fleet? No, sir, Sektan replied. The patrol boats fled. The orbital platforms never fired a shot. The humans used something else. Something else? Zarthek's voice was dangerously quiet. Elaborate. Sektan took a deep breath and began to describe what he had witnessed. The spatial distortions, the reality manipulation, the casual erasure of ships from existence itself. As he spoke, he watched the expressions of the council members shift from anger to confusion to something approaching fear. You're describing impossibilities, Admiral Vexine interrupted. No species has technology capable of manipulating space-time itself. The humans do, Sektan said firmly. I watched them do it. My entire crew witnessed it. Ships didn't explode or break apart. They simply stopped existing. Assuming what you're saying is true, Zarthek said slowly, why haven't the humans used these weapons before? Why allow themselves to be seen as weak? Because they chose to be seen that way, Sektan replied. According to their captain, they've had this capability for 50 years. They could have conquered the galaxy decades ago, but they chose restraint instead. The council members exchanged glances. The idea that a species would voluntarily limit their own power was alien to Draconian thinking. In their culture, strength was meant to be displayed, used, expanded upon. What do they want? Admiral Kethvar asked. Surrender? Tribute? Acknowledgement of their supremacy? Nothing, Sektan said. They want to go back to being diplomats and merchants. They want the galaxy to forget what happened at Kepler Prime and return to the way things were. Impossible, Zarthek snarled. Word of this defeat will spread. Other species will see Draconian weakness. Our enemies will grow bold. Our allies will question our strength. With respect, sir, Sektan said carefully, I don't think the humans care about our political problems. They made their point. They demonstrated that they're not weak, just restrained. Now they want to go back to restraint. For several minutes, the council chamber was silent except for the quiet hum of environmental systems. Finally, Admiral Mordek spoke. Commander Sektan, you've served the Empire for 30 years. You've led successful campaigns against 6 different species. Your courage and competence are unquestioned. But what you're describing challenges everything we understand about galactic power structures. I know, sir, Sektan replied. But I saw what I saw. The humans aren't just another species with better weapons. They've transcended conventional warfare entirely. They've moved beyond the arms race that defines galactic civilization. Then we'll develop countermeasures, Zarthek declared. We'll study their technology, learn their weaknesses, find ways to defeat them. Sektan felt a chill run down his spine. Sir, I don't think you understand. This isn't a new type of weapon we can counter. They're manipulating the fundamental forces of reality itself. They're not playing by the same rules as the rest of us. Every weapon has a counter, Admiral Vexine insisted. Every shield can be penetrated. Every technology can be matched or exceeded. Can it? Sektan asked quietly. Can we match the ability to erase matter from existence? Can we counter weapons that exist outside of normal spacetime? Can we develop defenses against attacks that come from dimensions we can't even perceive? The questions hung in the air like accusations. The council members, warriors who had spent their lives studying military strategy and technology, found themselves facing concepts that their training hadn't prepared them for. What do you recommend, Commander? Zarthek asked finally. Sektan had been dreading this question because he knew his answer would be seen as cowardice by his superiors, but he also knew it was the only rational response to what he had witnessed. We leave them alone, he said. We acknowledge that humanity is not a target we can afford to threaten. We adjust our expansion plans to avoid human space, and we make sure that no Draconian forces ever provoke them again. The explosion of angry voices from the council was immediate and predictable. Words like cowardice and defeatism filled the air. Admiral Kethvar was on his feet, demanding that Sektan be stripped of rank for suggesting surrender to an inferior species. But through the chaos, Sektan noticed that Grand Admiral Zarthek remained silent, his golden eyes thoughtful. When the other council members finally quieted down, Zarthek spoke. Commander Sektan, you mentioned that the humans offered you a choice. What exactly did they say? They said we could tell our people that humanity isn't weak, just restrained. They said there's a difference and it's an important one. They gave us the chance to choose a different path. And if we don't, if we refuse to accept their demonstration of power, Sektan met his commander's gaze steadily, then they'll have to teach the lesson again. But next time they won't offer the same choice. The chamber fell silent as the full implications of that statement sank in. The humans hadn't destroyed the Draconian fleet out of anger or conquest. They had done it as a lesson, a demonstration of capability. But next time the lesson might be final. Grand Admiral Zarthek stared at Sektan for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thank you, Commander. You're dismissed. As Sektan left the council chamber, he could hear the argument resuming behind him. Some council members wanted revenge. Others wanted to study human technology. And a few seemed to understand the magnitude of what they were facing. But one thing was certain, the galaxy would never be the same again. 6 months after the destruction of the Draconian fleet at Kepler Prime, Ambassador Sarah Chen walked into the Galactic Council chambers to find the atmosphere completely transformed. The usual bustle of diplomatic activity had been replaced by an uncomfortable tension that seemed to permeate every conversation, every gesture, every glance. The humans still occupied their modest corner of the chamber, still used their simple tablets and basic technology, but now, every other species in the room was acutely aware of their presence in a way that hadn't existed before. Conversations quieted when humans passed by. Diplomatic requests that once would have taken weeks to process were now handled within hours. Trade agreements that had languished in committee for months were suddenly fast-tracked to completion. Sarah took her usual seat and activated her tablet, noting the agenda items for today's session. Routine matters mostly, but she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. The galaxy's perception of humanity had undergone a fundamental shift, and the adjustment was proving difficult for everyone involved. Ambassador Chen, came a familiar voice. She looked up to see Representative Zektar approaching, but the arrogant Draconian who had mocked humanity's weakness 6 months ago was gone. In his place stood a being who moved carefully, spoke quietly, and kept his golden eyes respectfully lowered. Representative Zektar, Sarah replied neutrally. How can I help you? I wanted to apologize, Zektar said, the words seeming to pain him physically, for my comments 6 months ago, for my people's actions, for the misunderstanding that led to the Kepler incident. Sarah studied his face carefully. The proud warrior who had called humans weak and simple was barely recognizable. Word of what had happened to the Draconian fleet had spread throughout the galaxy, despite official attempts to suppress it. Too many species had intelligence networks, too many witnesses had survived, too many questions had been asked about the sudden disappearance of 3,000 warships. Apology accepted, Sarah said simply, though I hope you understand that the responsibility for those events doesn't rest with you personally. Zektar flinched slightly at the reminder. My government has reconsidered our expansion policies. We will no longer be seeking to establish dominance over other species through military action. That's good to hear, Sarah replied, though she noticed he hadn't said they were abandoning expansion entirely, just changing their methods. The galaxy is more peaceful when disputes are resolved through dialogue. Yes, Zektar agreed quickly. Dialogue is preferable. After he left, Sarah noticed several other ambassadors watching the exchange with interest. The Crystalline Collective's representative approached next, followed by delegates from the Void Wraiths, the Xerian Republic, and half a dozen other species. All had similar messages: renewed interest in human friendship, eagerness to negotiate better trade agreements, offers of cultural and scientific exchange. During the formal session, Sarah watched the dynamics of galactic politics shift in real time. Species that had dismissed human proposals for decades were now championing them. Military buildups that had been justified as defensive necessities were being quietly scaled back. The arms race that had defined galactic civilization for centuries was showing signs of slowing for the first time in recorded history. But Sarah also noticed troubling undercurrents. Fear had replaced respect in many interactions. Species weren't cooperating with humanity because they wanted to, but because they were afraid not to. The careful balance of diplomatic relationships that humans had worked so hard to build was being replaced by something more primitive and less stable. After the session ended, Sarah made her way to a secure communication room in the human embassy. Director Morrison was waiting for her, along with Admiral Vasquez, who had traveled from Earth specifically for this briefing. How are they adjusting? Morrison asked without preamble. Badly, Sarah replied honestly. Fear isn't a sustainable foundation for diplomacy. They're cooperating for now, but it's the kind of cooperation that breeds resentment. Admiral Vasquez nodded grimly. We've been monitoring military buildups across the galaxy. Most species have scaled back their expansion plans, but several are redirecting resources toward defensive research. They're trying to develop countermeasures to our capabilities. Can they succeed? Morrison asked. Eventually, probably, Vasquez admitted. What we demonstrated at Kepler Prime was advanced, but it wasn't magic. Given enough time and resources, other species could develop similar technologies. The question is whether we want them to. Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of unintended consequences. We wanted to demonstrate that humans weren't weak. Instead, we've convinced the galaxy that we're terrifyingly powerful. That's not the same thing. No, it's not, Morrison agreed. And it's creating exactly the kind of arms race we were trying to avoid. If other species develop reality manipulation technology, we'll be right back where we started, except with weapons that could literally unmake the universe. So what do we do? Sarah asked. Admiral Vasquez pulled up a holographic display showing human space and the surrounding sectors. We've been considering several options. We could share some of our lesser technologies, help other species feel less vulnerable. We could establish formal protection agreements, become the galaxy's guardian species, or, Morrison prompted. Or we could demonstrate something else, Vasquez said quietly. Not our ability to destroy, but our commitment to restraint. Sarah understood immediately. You want to voluntarily limit our capabilities. More than that, Vasquez explained. We want to create safeguards that prevent any species, including ourselves, from developing weapons that could threaten reality itself. We've opened Pandora's box. Now we need to figure out how to put the contents back. Morrison looked skeptical. You're talking about giving up our greatest strategic advantage, are we? Vasquez countered. Our greatest strategic advantage has always been our ability to think beyond conventional paradigms. What's more unconventional than a species voluntarily limiting its own power for the greater good? Sarah found herself nodding slowly. It would certainly be unprecedented. No species in galactic history has ever willingly reduced their military capabilities while they held a decisive advantage. Exactly, Vasquez said. And that's what would make it so powerful. We wouldn't be giving up our advantage. We'd be transforming it into something else entirely. Into what? Morrison asked. Into trust, Sarah said, understanding dawning. If we can convince the galaxy that we're willing to limit ourselves, to create binding restrictions on reality manipulation technology, then other species might be willing to do the same. It's a risk, Morrison pointed out. If we're wrong, if other species see it as weakness rather than wisdom, we could end up defenseless against the next ambitious empire. Admiral Vasquez smiled grimly. James, we've spent the last century being underestimated. I think we can survive being underestimated again. Over the following weeks, Sarah began implementing what would later be known as the Kepler Accords. Working with representatives from dozens of species, humanity proposed a galaxy-wide treaty, limiting the development of reality manipulation technology. The negotiations were complex, requiring careful balance between legitimate scientific research and potentially dangerous weapons development. To everyone's surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Species that had been scrambling to develop countermeasures to human technology suddenly found themselves with an alternative path. Instead of an arms race that could destabilize the fundamental nature of reality, they could choose cooperation and mutual limitation. The Draconian Empire was among the first to sign the accords, with Representative Zektar declaring that his people had learned the value of restraint from humanity's example. Other species followed, until nearly every major civilization in the galaxy had agreed to the restrictions. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same council chambers where Zektar had once mocked humanity's weakness. But now, she was addressing a special session called to commemorate the signing of the Kepler Accords. Representatives from across the galaxy filled the chamber, and for the first time in years, the atmosphere was one of genuine cooperation rather than fear or competition. The events at Kepler Prime taught us all an important lesson, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. Power without restraint is not strength. It's madness. True strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to choose not to. She looked around the chamber at faces representing dozens of species, each of whom had made the choice to limit their own potential for destruction in favor of collective security. Today we choose wisdom, she continued. We choose to be stronger together than any of us could be alone. We choose to prove that the most dangerous species in the galaxy isn't the one with the biggest weapons, but the one smart enough to put those weapons away. As applause filled the chamber, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. Humanity had been forced to reveal their hidden strength, had demonstrated capabilities that terrified the galaxy, and had then chosen to voluntarily limit those same capabilities for the greater good.